Hey there, folks. Welcome to part 2 of The Man Who Sold His Shadow to a Witch. In the last part, Bayo made a choice that would forever change his life. But can redemption truly be earned? Find out how his journey leads to a final, shocking twist. If you missed part 1, don't worry, catch up and join the ride as Bayo faces his biggest test yet. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for more unbelievable twists. The days passed after Bayo had regained his shadow, and life in the village had returned to some semblance of peace. His wealth had brought him no closer to happiness, but at least he had his soul back, or so he thought. His days were filled with routine. He managed his riches, helped the villagers, and tried to heal the wounds that his greed had caused. But one night, as the moon hung heavy in the sky, something strange happened. Bayo stood in his garden, staring at his reflection in the moonlit pond when he noticed a shadow, not his own, hovering in the water. The shadow was larger, darker, and as it stretched across the ground, it seemed to move on its own. Fear coursed through him as the realization hit. The witch had returned. Her presence, once hidden in the past, now seemed to fill the air, and the very earth beneath his feet seemed to tremble with a sense of foreboding. Bayo's shadow began to react to the strange power, shifting and distorting, as if no longer under his control. The witch's laughter echoed through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. "You thought you could escape the price of your greed, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice as cold as the night. In the days that followed, Bayo felt the shadow's influence grow stronger. It no longer obeyed his movements, no longer cast the comforting outline of his figure on the ground. Instead, it seemed to live a life of its own, stretching out on its own accord, sometimes creeping into places Bayo did not go. Fear began to consume him. At night, when he tried to sleep, the shadow grew restless, twisting and contorting, its form becoming ever more sinister. It would haunt him, reminding him of the deal he had made. The villagers noticed it too. They no longer greeted him with the same warmth. Whispers of his darkened shadow spread like wildfire. "He is cursed," they said. "A man without a soul." And in a way, they were right. For the shadow that had returned was no longer his own. It had been altered, darkened by the witch's revenge, now a manifestation of his greed. No amount of gold or riches could fill the void the shadow left behind, and Bayo began to understand that this was no ordinary return. The curse had only just begun. With the witch's wrath unleashed, the shadow was no longer just a part of him. It was a reflection of his sins, and it was now turning against him. Bayo, consumed by the growing power of the shadow, went to seek the witch once again, hoping for answers. He ventured deep into the forest where he had once made the bargain. As he entered the witch's domain, the forest felt colder, the air heavier, filled with a dark, palpable force. The witch had returned, and her power was stronger than before. The trees around Bayo whispered, their branches twisting as though reaching out to him. The path to the witch's hut seemed longer than ever, the ground beneath his feet almost unwilling to let him pass. He felt the earth's resistance as if it knew the danger he was walking into. Finally he reached her hut, standing before the same twisted trees that had once sealed his fate. The witch stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unsettling light. "I see you've come again, Bayo," she said, her voice smooth like silk, yet filled with venom. "You thought you could undo your mistake, but you can never undo what you have done." The witch's hand raised, and a dark mist poured from the ground. "Your shadow now belongs to me. And so do you," she said, as Bayo fell to his knees. The witch's curse had taken root, and Bayo could do nothing but watch as his soul seemed to slip further away from him, bound forever to the darkness that had returned. Bayo's mind was a whirlwind of desperation. "What have I done?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his regret. "I only wanted to live. I wanted a better life for myself." His words fell into the silence that hung heavy around them. The witch's gaze remained fixed on him, cold and unwavering. "You wanted more than life could offer," she replied, "and now you will pay the price for your greed. There is no escape, Bayo. You traded your soul for power, and now you will never be free." Bayo's chest tightened with panic. "Please," he begged, "I will do anything. I will give you everything I have. Just give me back my shadow." The witch's laughter was dark and cruel, filling the air like an omen. "The shadow you once had no longer belongs to you," she said. "I have taken it, and now it is bound to me. To regain it, you must make an even greater sacrifice." Her eyes glowed brighter, and she raised her hand. Bayo watched as the shadows around him began to twist and stretch, closing in on him. "The only way to undo your mistake is to make the ultimate sacrifice. But the price is higher than you can imagine. You will lose everything, and perhaps even more." With that, the witch vanished into the mist, leaving Bayo alone, trembling with the weight of his choices. The shadows continued to move around him, whispering of the price he would soon have to pay. Bayo stood in the darkness, his heart heavy with the weight of his regret. His shadow, twisted and dark, loomed in front of him, a constant reminder of his greed. The witch's words echoed in his mind. Make the ultimate sacrifice. What could he sacrifice to undo the deal? He had already lost his soul, his connection to the world around him. The villagers no longer recognized the man he had been, and Bayo began to fear that there was no way out. But the witch had spoken of a path to redemption, a way to regain what he had lost. He realized that this path would not be easy. It would require him to face the deepest parts of himself, the parts he had long buried under his ambition and desires. With no other choice, Bayo set off to find a way to redeem himself, knowing that the journey would be fraught with danger and sacrifice. As he ventured into the night, the shadows seemed to follow him, a reminder that his shadow's price had yet to be fully paid. Bayo's life, once again, seemed to be on a path of redemption. He had regained his shadow and found some semblance of peace in his wealth and hard-earned respect from the villagers. The feeling of emptiness that once consumed him was beginning to fade, but the subtle darkness still lingered in the corners of his mind. One night, as Bayo stood outside his mansion, the moon's light reflected eerily on the polished stone. His shadow seemed strange. It didn't match his movements. Instead, it twisted, stretched unnaturally, as if it had a life of its own. He brushed it off at first, thinking it was simply fatigue. But the shadows grew darker with each passing day. They clung to him in strange ways, growing larger than they should be, even when the sun was high. The villagers began to whisper again. The wealth that had once earned him their admiration now made them wary. The news spread that something was wrong with Bayo, but Bayo could feel it deep within himself, the uneasy connection to his own shadow and a gnawing suspicion that something had changed forever. Then, one night, the witch returned. In a flash of darkness, she appeared in front of him, her eyes glowing with a mixture of anger and malice. "You thought you could escape me, didn't you?" she asked with a smile that chilled him to the bone. "You have learned nothing." The witch's presence was overpowering. Her voice seemed to resonate through the very air, wrapping around Bayo's heart, tightening with every word she spoke. "You thought your wealth and power would protect you from the consequences of your greed," she said, her laugh echoing in the silence. "But your shadow is not your own anymore. It belongs to me, and with it, I will bring you the price of your arrogance." Bayo's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. His shadow, which had once felt like a part of him, now had a life of its own, a dark presence that followed his every step. No longer would it simply mirror his actions. It now moved independently of him, growing darker and more powerful with each passing day. It twisted around him, whispering in voices that Bayo could barely understand. It no longer resembled the familiar, comforting presence it once was. It had become a terrifying force. Bayo tried to fight it, tried to command his shadow to return to normal, but it was beyond his control. The more he tried to move, the more the shadow seemed to trap him, growing bigger and more sinister, as if it were alive. The villagers, once again, began to turn away from him. No one would come near him. His once illustrious mansion, now a prison, felt colder by the hour. And in his heart, Bayo knew this time the price would be far higher than before. Bayo could no longer hide from the consequences of his greed. The witch's presence seemed to haunt him everywhere. His shadow, no longer simply an extension of his body, was now an extension of her power, her darkness consuming him. She had come back stronger, more determined to see him pay for his folly. The villagers once again began to avoid him. Those who had once praised his wealth now feared his power and his strange shadow. His mansion, which had once symbolized his success, now symbolized his curse. His once peaceful sleep was now filled with nightmares, dreams of a dark forest where the witch's laughter echoed endlessly. But one night, the witch appeared before him again, this time with a warning. "You wanted power, Bayo," she said, her voice cutting through the night. "You sought wealth without understanding the cost. You lost not just your shadow, but your humanity, your soul. Now I will take what's left of you." Bayo tried to speak, but the witch raised her hand, silencing him. The shadows around them began to move, twisting and growing, as if the very darkness itself were alive. The witch was feeding off his fear, his regret. "There is no escape," she said coldly. "You will never be free of me." Desperation consumed Bayo. He had tried everything, he had sought redemption, but nothing had worked. His wealth was meaningless, and his shadow had become a symbol of his darkness. But now there was no turning back. He knew that his only chance at redemption lay with the witch. In a moment of clarity, he realized that he had been running from the truth all along. He had sold his soul for riches, and now he must face the consequences. He set off to find the witch again, to beg for a way out, to regain what he had lost. His journey through the dark forest was fraught with obstacles. The trees seemed to close in on him, the path became unclear, and the whispers of the shadows followed him. It was as if the forest itself was working against him, guiding him deeper into darkness. But Bayo pushed forward, driven by the last spark of hope that he could redeem himself. He finally reached the witch's hut, but it wasn't the same as before. The air was thick with magic, and the earth seemed to pulse beneath his feet. The witch was waiting for him, her eyes glowing brighter than ever before. "You seek redemption, but can you truly pay the price?" she asked. Bayo stood tall, despite his fear, ready to face whatever came next. Bayo kneeled before the witch, his heart heavy with regret and fear. "I have come to face the consequences of my actions," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, I beg you, let me undo what I have done. I will give up everything I have. I will sacrifice my wealth, my power, anything to reclaim my soul and restore what I lost." The witch stood over him, her eyes piercing through his very soul. "You have come to understand the true price of greed," she said. "But to reclaim your shadow, to undo the damage you've done, you must make a choice. You will give up all that you have gained, and more. Your soul must be cleansed, but that will come at a great cost." The witch raised her hand, and a shadowy mist surrounded Bayo, enveloping him in darkness. The deal was being made again, but this time, Bayo knew that the price would be far higher. The witch's voice echoed in the darkness. "Your soul will be tested, Bayo. You will face trials like never before. Only by proving your true worth will you reclaim what you've lost." The shadows around him swirled, and Bayo knew that the final test had begun. Bayo stood at the edge of the witch's forest, the darkness enveloping him like a suffocating cloak. The air was thick with magic, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He had made his choice, but the weight of that decision began to settle in as he walked deeper into the woods. The witch had promised him a way to redeem himself, but at what cost? His wealth, his power, those things no longer mattered. Bayo had come to understand that his soul was the true currency in this world. But as he ventured further, the path grew more treacherous. The trees whispered to him, their voices cold and haunting. "You seek redemption, but are you worthy?" the wind seemed to ask. Bayo's heart raced as he pressed forward, unsure of what awaited him. The witch had promised trials, but he didn't know what those trials would be. He only knew one thing. He had to face them head-on, no matter the cost. The shadow that had once followed him now seemed to lead him, its presence more oppressive than ever. With every step, he felt himself being pulled deeper into the darkness. The first trial was unlike anything Bayo had ever imagined. As he walked through the forest, the landscape began to change. The familiar trees and winding paths shifted into dark, twisted shapes, and the ground beneath his feet became slippery with the remnants of memories he had long buried. Suddenly, Bayo found himself standing in front of a mirror, its surface rippling with a strange light. His reflection appeared, but it was different. His face was twisted, his eyes filled with a hunger for more. "Is this who you really are?" the mirror whispered. Bayo stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. His reflection smiled back at him with a cruel, mocking grin. It was the face of the man who had sold his soul, the man who had sacrificed everything for greed. But then, the reflection began to shift, showing him the man he once was, the humble, hard-working Bayo, full of dreams and hope. For a moment, Bayo was paralyzed, torn between these two versions of himself. Which one was the true Bayo? The man who had lost everything, or the one who still had a chance at redemption? As the mirror seemed to distort, Bayo realized the trial was not about finding the right answer. It was about facing his own guilt and coming to terms with who he had become. Bayo's next trial came in the form of a vision of the village he had once called home. He saw the faces of the people he had loved, the friends and family who had once respected him. They were all gathered together, smiling, but there was something different about them. As Bayo stepped forward to join them, he noticed their eyes. They were all empty, hollow, as if they were nothing more than puppets. The air was heavy with an eerie silence, and as Bayo approached, they all turned to him, their faces twisted with resentment. "You took everything from us," they whispered in unison. "You took our trust, our love, and our very souls." Bayo's heart sank as he tried to reach out to them, but they faded away before his touch could land. The weight of their words hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time, he understood the true extent of what he had done. His greed had not just stolen his shadow. It had stolen his connection to the world, the people who had once been his family. He had become so consumed by his desire for power that he had abandoned those who mattered most. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the realization of how far he had fallen. The trial was not just a test of strength, but of humanity. Could Bayo find his way back to the man he had once been, or was he forever lost? The final trial was the most difficult of all. Bayo was led to a clearing in the forest, where the sky above was filled with dark, swirling clouds. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, glowing with a faint, eerie light. Upon the altar lay an ancient book, its pages filled with knowledge that could undo the curse that had taken hold of him. But as Bayo approached the altar, he saw something that made his heart stop. The book was open, and its pages were filled with the names of those who had sold their souls for power. His name was on the first page. Bayo had always believed that his desire for wealth and success had been his own, but now he saw that it was written in the stars, part of a larger pattern of greed and temptation that had consumed countless others. To undo the curse, Bayo would have to give up everything, the wealth he had amassed, the power he had gained, even the shadow he had once fought so hard to reclaim. The sacrifice would be immense, and the question remained, could he let go of everything he had worked for to save his soul? His heart screamed to keep what he had, to hold on to his newfound life, but his spirit knew the truth. He had to sacrifice his desires once and for all, to truly free himself from the chains of greed. Bayo stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he reached out to the ancient book. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, and he could feel the shadow lingering at the edges of his mind, waiting to consume him once again. The witch's voice echoed in his ears. "You have reached the end of your journey, Bayo. Now make your final choice." The book seemed to glow with an otherworldly power, the words on its pages shifting and changing with every passing moment. Bayo closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He had spent so much of his life chasing after riches, after power, but now he realized that none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was his soul. He turned away from the book, walking into the forest, knowing that the sacrifice would be hard, perhaps the hardest thing he would ever do. But as he left the altar behind, he felt the weight of his soul begin to lift, the shadows of his past fading into the light. Bayo had made his choice, to walk the path of humility and redemption. And with that, his journey to regain his humanity had only just begun. Bayo's decision to leave the altar behind was not an easy one. As he walked deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to follow him, as though the darkness had become a part of his very being. His heart was heavy, torn between the newfound understanding of the price he had paid and the yearning for the power and wealth he had once coveted. The path ahead was uncertain, the consequences of his actions still looming large in his mind. Could he truly live without the wealth he had once dreamed of? Could he survive without the respect and admiration that had come with his riches? The answers to those questions seemed far away as Bayo ventured further into the wilderness, feeling the isolation of his choice. The witch's curse was still fresh in his mind, the shadow, the darkness that had consumed him for so long. And yet, there was something freeing about his choice. The burden of greed was finally beginning to lift. As he continued on his journey, Bayo realized that the true price of greed was not just the wealth or the shadow, it was the cost of self-destruction. The price paid when one loses sight of what truly matters. But the path to redemption was not simple. Bayo knew that he had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful the journey ahead would be. Bayo's journey took him through dense forests, across vast rivers, and up towering mountains. He encountered many obstacles along the way: harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the relentless hunger that had plagued him before he had gained his riches. But none of these challenges were as difficult as the trials within his own heart. The further he traveled, the more his mind was flooded with memories of his former life. He remembered the laughter of his family, the joy he had once felt, the simple pleasures that had been stripped from him by his desire for more. Every step he took seemed to weigh him down with regret, the faces of those he had hurt appearing before him. The villagers who had once respected him now feared him, and he knew it was his greed that had caused the rift between them. Guilt gnawed at him as he reflected on how far he had fallen. He had once been a man of honor, but now he was a man burdened by the consequences of his actions. But as Bayo ventured deeper into the wilds, he began to understand something crucial. Only way to find peace was to confront the pain he had caused. He could no longer run from the truth. The trials he faced on this journey were not just about surviving the wilderness. They were about healing his own broken heart and making amends for the destruction he had wrought. As Bayo continued his journey, he stumbled upon a sacred grove, an ancient place where the earth seemed to pulse with the energy of his ancestors. The air was thick with the presence of spirits, and Bayo felt an overwhelming urge to sit and listen. He closed his eyes, and the whispers of the past filled his mind, the voices of those who had walked this land before him. His ancestors spoke to him not with anger, but with sadness and compassion. They spoke of the balance between man and nature, the respect that must be given to the land, and the dangers of greed that had so easily overcome him. Bayo listened, his heart heavy with the weight of their words. For the first time, he understood that his journey was not just about reclaiming his soul, it was about restoring balance. healing the wounds he had caused, and learning to live in harmony with the earth and his fellow man. The spirits of his ancestors offered him guidance, showing him how to repair the damage he had done. Bayo realized that the true path to redemption lay not in the pursuit of material wealth, but in spiritual growth, in reconnecting with the values of honor, respect, and humility. As he opened his eyes, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The spirits had spoken, and he had listened. Bayo made his way back to the village, his heart now lighter than it had been in years. The road was long, but with each step, he felt the weight of his past sins lifting from his shoulders. When he finally returned to the village, he was no longer the man who had once been consumed by greed. The villagers who had once feared him now saw the change in his eyes, a transformation that could not be ignored. But Bayo knew that forgiveness would not come easily. He had to earn it. He spent the following days helping the villagers, working side by side with those he had once wronged. He repaired the homes that had fallen into disrepair, shared what little he had left, and listened to the stories of the people he had once abandoned. Slowly but surely, the villagers began to accept him once again. They saw the change in him not just in his actions but in his heart. Bayo had learned the true value of life, the importance of self-reflection, and the need to humble oneself before others. But even as the villagers began to trust him again, Bayo knew that the true redemption would come from within. He had to live the rest of his life with the understanding that his shadow had been restored, but it would never again be used for the purposes of greed. Bayo had lived a lifetime in the years since he made the deal with the witch. His shadow had been returned, but the journey for redemption was far from over. One day, as he walked through the village, he was greeted by the familiar faces of his friends who had once shunned him. But now they welcomed him with open arms. As Bayo looked at them, he realized something important. The true power was not in wealth or status, but in the connections he had made, in the people he had helped, and in the peace he had found within himself. It was then that he understood the shadow was no longer a symbol of greed, but of his humanity, of his journey toward redemption. He had paid the price of his past sins, and now he stood as a man who had learned to live not for riches, but for the betterment of his people and the earth he had once sought to dominate. Bayo had finally found peace. Bayo's life had slowly started to take on a new form, but it was a long journey. His wealth, which had once consumed him, now seemed like a distant memory, a reminder of a time when he had been blind to the true value of life, no longer trapped. In his mansion surrounded by riches, Bayo had returned to the village, not as a man of power, but as one of the people. He spent his days working the fields, repairing homes, and helping those who had once shunned him. With every act of kindness, he felt his soul begin to heal. The villagers who had once feared him now looked at him with respect, but more importantly, with compassion. Bayo had become one of them, no longer a figure of wealth and greed, but a man who had learned the importance of humility and community. His once darkened heart had begun to open again, and he found peace in the simple acts of helping others. The shadow that had once symbolized his greed was now a symbol of growth and redemption. A reminder that no matter how far one falls, there is always a chance to rise again. As the seasons changed, Bayo faced yet another challenge. Though his heart had healed, he was still haunted by the memories of his past greed. One day, a traveler arrived in the village, a wealthy merchant who offered Bayo an incredible opportunity, a chance to return to the life of luxury and power that he had once enjoyed. The offer seemed tempting. Bayo could have everything he had once dreamed of: wealth, status, and a return to the life he had left behind. For a moment, the old temptation stirred within him. He remembered the feeling of control, the thrill of having everything at his fingertips. But as he thought about the offer, he felt something different, something he had never experienced before. It was peace. Bayo realized that the life he had now, though simple and humble, was worth more than all the riches in the world. The test of his humility had come, and this time he chose the path of contentment. He turned down the merchant's offer, knowing that the price of his soul was far greater than any wealth could ever be. Just as Bayo thought he had found peace, the witch appeared once more. This time she did not come with threats or dark promises, but with an offer of her own. She told him that she had been watching him, seeing the change in him, and that he had passed the greatest test, the test of humility. She told him that he had learned the true value of life, that it was not in the material world, but in the connections he had built, in the love he had rediscovered for others, and in the peace he had finally found within himself. The witch smiled at him, not with malice, but with approval. "You have redeemed yourself, Bayo," she said. "Your shadow has been returned to you, not as a curse, but as a blessing. You have learned what many cannot, the price of greed, and the power of humility. Your soul is yours once more." With a wave of her hand, the witch disappeared into the wind, leaving Bayo standing in the village square, surrounded by the people who had once feared him. For the first time in years, he felt complete, no longer a man driven by desire, but one at peace with himself and the world around him. In the days that followed, Bayo began to see the world differently. The wealth and power that had once ruled his life no longer had the same appeal. He had everything he needed now: community, purpose, and self-worth. The village became his family, and he worked alongside them every day, no longer seeking praise or reward, but simply giving of himself to help those in need. His shadow, once a symbol of his greed, now became a symbol of transformation. It was a reminder of the journey he had taken, of the lessons he had learned, and the man he had become. Bayo realized that true wealth was not in material things, but in the relationships he had built and the peace he had found within himself. As the years passed, Bayo's life flourished, not in riches, but in love, in respect, and in the joy of helping others. He had found something far greater than wealth: contentment. His journey was long, but in the end, it was a journey worth taking, for he had found the one thing he had always searched for: inner peace. Bayo's story became a tale told through generations. The villagers spoke of his journey not just as a cautionary tale of greed, but as a tale of redemption. They spoke of the man who had lost everything, who had made a bargain with the witch, and who had found himself in the end. Bayo became a symbol of hope, showing that no matter how far one falls, redemption is possible for those who seek it. His story was passed down to children as a lesson of the dangers of greed, but also of the power of humility, compassion, and self-awareness. And though Bayo's wealth had long since faded, his legacy lived on in the hearts of the people he had helped and the peace he had brought to his village. In the end, Bayo learned that the true riches of life are not found in material wealth, but in the love we give, the lessons we learn, and the peace we find within ourselves. After years of struggle, Bayo finally found peace, not in riches, but in humility and redemption. The witch who once cursed him returned to acknowledge his transformation, offering him a final blessing for his newfound wisdom. With his soul cleansed and his shadow no longer a symbol of greed, Bayo realized that true wealth was not in power, but in the connections he had restored with his people. The villagers, once again, saw him as a man of honor and humility. Bayo's journey proved that redemption is not just about undoing the past, but living out the lessons learned, for true change comes from within. Thanks for watching till the end. If this story gave you goosebumps, give it a like and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below and let me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I read everyone. Till then, take care, folks.